Good morning and welcome to the launch of the NCA, the National Crime Agency's National Strategic Assessment of Serious Organised Crime for this year. My name is Misha Glennie and I'll be moderating this morning's event. You may know me as the author of McMafia, a non-fiction book about the globalization of organised crime, which of course was turned into a BBC TV series last year, a fictional one as it happens. Now, when the book first came out over a decade ago, the issue of organised crime was still quite low on the priority list. Here in the United Kingdom, it was often regarded as something that happened elsewhere. But as the Director General of the National Crime Agency, Lynn Owens, will be explaining in a moment, serious and organised crime affects more UK citizens more often than any other national security threat. And unlike those others, it comes in many shapes and sizes, different varieties, so combating it requires considerable resources and an enhanced intelligence capacity. Nowadays, organised crime is an international business which operates across borders and jurisdictions, both within and between states, and that means cooperation between police forces is absolutely essential. Now, I've written both about traditional mafia-style organised crime as well as the new kid on the block, cybercrime. Cybercrime attracts a very different type of personality because, unlike traditional organised crime, it doesn't necessarily need to threaten violence as a mafia group has to. This has allowed all sorts of new players to enter the market. And as I've watched organised crime develop over the past 5 to 10 years, the most worrying trend is a fusion between traditional organised crime and cyber. As far as I can ascertain, there is not a single sector of organised criminal activity which has not scaled up its capacity by adapting to new technology, a technology, of course, that easily transcends borders. So the NCA is having to adapt with incredible speed to a rapidly changing criminal environment. They need the old skills, but they need a new set of skills as well. So let me welcome Lynn onto stage. She is the Director General of the NCA, and she's going to introduce this year's National Strategic Assessment and to explain the challenges which her organisation faces. Lynn, the floor is yours.
Thank you to everyone for joining us today. I want to talk to you about a current threat to this country that is both chronic and corrosive, and it's as serious as it has been in any of our lifetimes. One of the greatest challenges we face in dealing with serious and organised crime is its hidden nature. And there is a danger that we become complacent about the things that we cannot see. The National Strategic Assessment that we have published today shines a light into those hidden places and reveals a true reality that should concern us all. It is the most comprehensive assessment that we have ever produced, and it describes in detail the growing and ever-changing threat from serious and organised crime to individuals, to communities, and to wider society. So some facts. Serious and organised crime affects more UK citizens more frequently than any other national security threat. Serious and organised crime kills more of our citizens every year than terrorism, war, and natural disaster combined. Serious and organised crime costs the UK economy at least £70 billion each year. Just to bring that alive, that's almost £2,000 for every family, and that's likely to be a significant underestimate. There are more than 4,542 organised crime groups active in the UK, and there are believed to be at least 181,000 people involved in serious and organised crime. Again, to bring it alive, That's more than twice the strength of the British Army. The numbers are vast, but the threat is growing and evolving at breakneck speed. So we know that there are nearly 2.9 million accounts registered on the worst child sex abuse sites on the dark web worldwide, more than 5% of which we believe are from offenders based here, within the UK. The number of referrals to the National Crime Agency from industry of online child sexual abuse and exploitation has increased by 700%. Referrals of victims of modern slavery increased by 36% in 2018 compared with the year before, and it's more than 80% if you look back to 2016. The number of county lines, drug supply lines, has increased from over 720 to around 2,000 in a little over a year. And financial losses from fraud soared by an incredible 32% between April and September 2018. There were 3.6 million incidents of fraud reported in England and Wales in 2018 at an overall cost of £190 billion. To confront this mutating threat, I have set 3 operational priorities for all of us. We will target those who exploit the vulnerable through child sexual exploitation and abuse, through trafficking, through servitude, through fraud, and indeed other forms of abuse on the vulnerable. As just one example, in March 2018, a Manchester man was jailed for 15 years for raping a 6-month-old baby and sexually assaulting a 2-year-old boy. Within 24 hours of intelligence being received from United States authorities, we used our specialist victim identification officers and other capabilities to identify and arrest the offender and to safeguard both children. Secondly, we will target those who dominate communities and chase profits in the criminal marketplace through violence or criminal reputation in the supply of drugs and firearms. This month, in fact, last week, 2 men were jailed for a total of 29.5 years for conspiring to sell handguns made at an illegal gun factory in Sussex. At the time of their arrest, we seized 3 complete weapons and a further 120 were in the process of being made. 6 more guns made at that facility have since been recovered by law enforcement, one of which is known to have been used in London in 2 attempted murders. But the threat is not just homegrown. Last month, we stopped 12 handguns from entering the UK from Latvia. These weapons were destined for East Anglia, where again, they would have been used to cause fear and intimidation and commit serious violence in communities. Finally, we will target those who undermine the UK's economy, integrity, infrastructure and institutions through their criminality. As a result of just one long-running operation, we have seized more than £95 million worth of cash, denying its use to fund future criminal activity. I cannot tell you how proud I am of the women and men I work alongside in the National Crime Agency, across law enforcement, but also partners in government, the charity sector, and of course industry. But none of us are complacent about the scale of the challenges we face. It is a challenge that is made all the greater by the overwhelming pace at which technology is developing. It's an enabler of harm, but it's also an accelerator of harm. I have mentioned the dark web, which allows criminals to hide their location and their identity. In one case, we targeted the users of a dark website containing more than 145,000 of the most horrific child sexual abuse images. They have been downloaded more than 1 million times. Our work into just one of those vile offenders led to him being jailed for 22 years after he raped a 5-year-old boy and abused a 3-year-old girl, working with partners in South Korea and the United States, we used our victim identification specialist capabilities again to identify the offender and safeguard both victims. In January this year, 3 men who ran a dark web business selling the lethal drugs fentanyl and carfentanil to hundreds of customers across the UK and worldwide were jailed for 43.5 years. When officers from the National Crime Agency and West Yorkshire Police raided the drug facility, they made the single largest seizure of carfentanil made to date in Europe. That is equivalent to millions of lethal doses. Cryptocurrencies are increasingly being used to launder criminal funds. In April this year, we secured the conviction of one of the most prolific cyber criminals ever identified in the UK. He was sentenced to more than 6 years in prison. He and his group owned and operated one of the most sophisticated pieces of malicious software ever developed, with his criminality affecting millions of people in communities across more than 20 countries. He generated millions in ransom payments by blackmailing countless victims and threatening them with bogus police investigations, using virtual and cryptocurrency technology to launder the proceeds. Day by day, hour by hour, the threat is escalating and evolving. There has been a growing debate recently about the duty the tech sector have to protect their users and prevent criminal abuse of their systems. Technology already exists to design out a lot of the preventable offending. Industry must block child abuse images upon detection and do more to prevent online grooming. It must work with us to stop live streaming of child abuse. It must do more to stop its platforms being used to advertise the services, whether that be of people smugglers or to facilitate sexual exploitation. It must be more open and share best practice. In short, it must do more and it must do it quicker. There is a need for nothing less than a revolution in the way that tech companies rise to this challenge. The majority of serious and organised crime in the UK continues to have clear international links. Organised crime groups active in the UK continue to source illegal commodities and exploit the vulnerable from beyond our shores, underlining the importance of international partnerships. In one operation, we disrupted a criminal network attempting to smuggle 1.4 tonnes of cocaine into the UK by yacht. 5 individuals were sentenced to a total of 120 years. Professional enablers such as accountants and solicitors play a pivotal role in facilitating the movement and concealment of criminal finance, as seen from the many high-value investigations into illicit finance and asset denial in the last year. Just in recent days, after a gruelling case that lasted 8 years, we recovered £6 million worth of assets from a significant money laundering group, including a hotel and a Bentley. Some of the proceeds of crime were held by a practicing barrister. As the threat evolves, as criminals adapt and refine their methods, so too must we. We must stay ahead. To do that, we must build new and advanced capabilities, developing the skills and the tools we need to pursue those offenders who pose the greatest risk and cause the greatest harm. Today, law enforcement is under pressure like never before. Crime is rising, certainly crime of the most serious crimes. Complexity is rising as criminals continue to cross both geographic borders and digital frontiers. Threat is rising as criminal networks become more extensive, more sophisticated, and in many cases prepared to use greater levels of violence, just at the point where resources are under the greatest strain. Given the vast scale and rapid evolution of the threat, it is our professional judgment that the law enforcement system needs investment of an additional £2.7 billion over 3 years. Some may say we cannot afford to do that, to which my response is simply this: we cannot afford not to. The investment will enable us to resource growing demand and to build capabilities in areas such as digital forensics, covert surveillance, financial investigations, and other critical skills we need to combat serious and organised crime in the 21st century. Visible frontline policing is vital to public safety, but the reality is that we will not defeat serious and organised crime with beat officers alone. Some of the capabilities we need are most effectively and efficiently delivered at the local or regional level. Others, however, the National Crime Agency must deliver on a national basis, providing the right capabilities at the right time to deliver maximum impact. As part of that overall investment, the National Crime Agency specifically is seeking to increase our annual budget by £650 million to £1 billion. For those that say that's a lot of money, that's an amount less than serious and organised crime costs the country each and every week. This will enable us to drive and deliver the holistic approach we need and to fulfil our mission of leading the UK's fight to cut serious and organised crime. Pursuing offenders through prosecution and disruption, bringing all our collective powers to bear, preventing people from engaging in serious and organised crime, protecting victims, organisations and systems from harm, and preparing for when it occurs, mitigating its impact. There has never been a dedicated funding stream for serious and organised crime, restricting our ability to focus investment strategically on the highest priority skills. Now is the time to address that. Despite the courageous and exemplary work of police and National Crime Agency officers across the country, we need to invest further to get ahead of the threat. The choice is stark. Failing to invest will result in the gradual erosion of our capabilities and therefore our ability to protect the public. Serious and organised crime is a societal issue. To fight it, we need a societal response. It is not a threat that law enforcement can fight alone. We need government, and delighted to see both the Security Minister and Shadow Security Minister here today. We need government to invest, empower and enable law enforcement to pursue those offenders who pose the greatest risk to our communities. The finance and regulated sectors to help crack down on illicit finance that underpins and rewards criminality. The technology sector to work with us with their professional expertise and reducing criminal abuse of their platforms. And crucially, we need the public. The public are our eyes and ears to be alert to the signs of serious and organised crime in our communities, much of which is hidden in plain sight. To report any concerns and to consider their own behaviours and their own choices, which may, however unwittingly, support serious and organised crime, from the use of recreational drugs to cheap and exploited labour in nail bars, car washes and elsewhere. The sheer scale of the human and financial cost of serious and organised crime is vast. It is a chronic threat, evolving and mutating as it changes to reflect our ever-changing society. It is a corrosive threat, tearing at the fabric of our communities and our country's economic well-being. Each of us is affected by serious and organised crime in some way. Each and every one of us has a role to play in combating it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Well, of course, one of the things you highlighted was the really horrific crime of online child abuse. And so it's appropriate that I'd now like to invite to the stage the Chief Executive of the NSPCC, Peter Wanless, who's going to talk to us for 10 to 15 minutes. Peter.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to Lynn and the National Crime Agency for inviting me to speak here. It's great to be involved in the launch of such a crucial piece of work that outlines so vividly the threat that serious and organised crime raises across the UK. By drawing attention so clearly to the nature of the threats that we face today, the NCA not only showcases the crucial role law enforcement must play in the disruption and the destruction of such crimes, you also help others, government, industry, charities, parents, communities, and the public better understand the horrific consequences of serious organised crime and how we can best work in partnership to protect and to prevent the terrible abuse of very many victims. And the consequences for children and young people are shot right through today's National Strategic Assessment. It gives a stark picture of some of the urgent child protection challenges. Recognition is an essential first step. A decisive response is what matters. Let me start with sexual abuse online to illustrate how working together can make a difference. Last year, we saw a 16% rise in the number of police-recorded child sexual offences across the UK. Worryingly, offences of this nature have been steadily increasing for the past 5 years. A clear factor contributing to this is the growth of technology. The opening up of an unregulated online world represents a clear and present danger to all children. It provides sexual predators with numerous unchallenged opportunities to target and groom children and young people. Through Childline, we're hearing on a daily basis about the number of young people experiencing horrible online experiences of one sort or another. We know that in 2017-18, there were over 3,000 counselling sessions delivered about online safety concerns and over 2,200 about sexual abuse online. More offences of this nature are being committed than ever before, and it's vital that adults committing such deliberate and calculated crimes against the vulnerable are brought to justice. But it's also essential that the nature of such crimes are better understood. With law enforcement's help, we recognise the need to provide police with the tools to intervene to safeguard children and bring perpetrators to justice at an earlier stage. The NSPCC's Flaw in the Law campaign fought to criminalise the sexual grooming of children by adults, making it an offence punishable by law. We no longer have to wait for contact abuse, despite evidence of frankly outrageous and disgusting behaviour and a clear underlying intent. With the success of that Flaw in the Law campaign in April 17, and over 50,000 NSPCC supporters were mobilised to persuade government of the need for this legal change, came the shocking exposure of the extent of online grooming. In the first year, police recorded more than 3,000 offences. That was twice as many as we'd expected. Police also uncovered over 80 different platforms being used by predators. By shedding light on crimes in this way, and by bringing them into the public sphere, we've inevitably made life more difficult for law enforcement in the short term. But we should make no apology for that. The more evidence and intelligence surrounding child abuse we can gather, the harder we can fight back. The earlier we intervene to identify and punish these crimes, the less likely they are to occur or spiral into something worse. Because abusers will continue to commit these crimes if they think they can get away with it. And prosecutions and punishment for deliberately exploitative behaviour are essential if we're going to prevent cruelty to children. But having exposed vividly the nature and the number of crimes against children, we didn't stop there. The case for regulation of social media was that much stronger as more young people understood what was happening to them was wrong, and a few brave ones were willing to speak up. Tragically, not those whose lives had been lost as a consequence of online grooming. The government must be forced to act, and to act fast. They need to step up and ensure fundamental child protection is designed into the online world. Things that our children come into contact with daily, such as food, toys, clothes, are all expected to meet high safety standards that let us know children are safe to use them, and the same must apply for social networks. And there should be no need for industry to await legislation to enact the recently released Online Harms White Paper. If major companies adopted now a mandatory duty of care for young people using their sites, many children would be safer and law enforcement's job would be easier. Now, there is, of course, a role for education too. The NSPCC's innovative partnership with O2 has helped parents take over 4.5 million actions to keep children safe over the last 3 years. We're able to give parents the information necessary to equip them to make robust decisions about safety on social media sites. Last year, we delivered online workshops to over 22,000 parents in schools and communities, and the NSPCC has trained O2 gurus in stores across the UK, meaning parents can access further support should they require it, even if they're not an O2 customer. Likewise, our work with the National Crime Agency's CEOP has developed a Keeping Children Safe online training course aimed at professionals as well as members of the public. And to ensure that more children are aware of the risks associated with online platforms, education in schools must not be neglected. It's a small victory that the government has made teaching of relationships and sexual education compulsory in England. Yet it's vital that the potential dangers be interwoven into lesson plans so that children are taught to be critical of what they see online and are given the ability to detect what is an accurate representation of a healthy relationship or otherwise. But it's not just grooming or online sexual abuse that we must fight to protect children and young people from harm. When the Rotherham grooming case exploded into the public conscience around 5 years ago, many people threw their hands up and said, how could so many young people have suffered the horrendous consequences of rape and exploitation apparently in plain sight? The story repeated itself in Rochdale, Telford, Oxford, and yet the National Strategic Assessment today highlights very clearly many more young people often not seen as victims until it is far too late in the grooming process. We read that males aged 15 to 17 are being the most likely to suffer from criminal exploitation for the purpose of county lines drug offending. And the children caught up in human trafficking are highlighted too. How often are they seen as victims? There's a critical need to fully comprehend the risks surrounding these young people in such situations. All too often this is overlooked, masked by the seemingly consensual appearance of the activity. Now, wider economic and social trends like rising poverty, drug addiction, mental health problems create the conditions that increase vulnerability and susceptibility to predators with criminal intent. For some of these young people, their predator is the person in their life offering them love, hope, and gifts they could never have expected anywhere else. It's important we remember that these are not just numbers, these are real children and people, lives and families. They walk among us, and they are often not the subject of sympathy and support until the consequences for their lives and others have been devastating. Devastating not only to relationships, to education, to health and well-being, but sometimes even to life itself. And years of failure to acknowledge and respond effectively to children who experience such suffering has only compounded the cost to individuals, community, and society. We know that adverse childhood experiences, traumatic events in a child's life, have lasting negative effects on health and well-being, which continue right the way into adulthood. So the utilisation of children for criminal purposes can have lasting consequences. And child abuse images which appear on the internet can resurface time and time again, meaning the victim is forced to undergo the trauma repeatedly. The ripple effect this inevitably causes means parents, family, teachers, and all those that have a relationship with the victim suffer too. So seeing children as children is vital. The correct response is not denial and detachment from the real world. It's not about limiting children's access to social media. It's not about preventing them from using the internet or keeping them indoors after dark. They cannot be expected to step away from the wonders of the online or the offline world. It's about seeing criminal activity for what it is. Which is why understanding these crimes and the role that exploitation of children is playing is so important. A multifaceted approach is vital if we're to ensure substantial change for the long term. An increased investment in serious organised crime is necessary, but this needs to filter through to social services, charities, youth workers, remember them, and other organisations, all fighting for the same outcomes. Preventative measures and those that mitigate consequences are important, but so too are those designing and delivering the services which attack the problem at its source. So I welcome warmly today the national assessment. I welcome its honesty, its vivid, descriptive nature, and the priority it places on safeguarding young people. Child exploitation should be a leading priority for every police force in England and Wales. This is vital if we're to fully understand the scale of the threat that children and young people are facing. It's vital if we're going to intervene early, and it's vital if we're going to ensure a robust and sensitive law and order response. I'd like to congratulate the NCA for rising to this challenge as national leaders in this sphere. The NSPCC's commitment to working in partnership remains stronger than ever, as together we fight for every childhood. Because it's childhood that shapes who we become. Abuse never should. Thank you.
Peter, and at this stage, I'd like to invite Andy Cook, who's the Chief Constable of Merseyside Police, to take his place here next to me on the panel, and also Bob Wigley, who's the Chair of UK Finance, and that is the trade association for the UK banking and financial sector. But Bob is also closely involved with issues relating to innovation and security in cyber. Before I go over to you, the audience, for questions, I'm going to ask Andy and Bob a question each, starting with Andy. Now, Andy, we've heard what Lynn had to say, and it's no great secret that sometimes the coordination of a nationwide agency like the NCA and 43 regional police forces runs into, how can I put it, occasional difficulties. So what do you see as the way forward, which is going to both respect regional autonomy but also assist the NCA in getting to grips with those complex issues around serious and organised crime?
Thank you. I find myself in a bit of a strange position for the Senior Chief Constable who leads on behalf of serious and organised crime nationally, because I am fully in agreement with every word the Director General has just said. Which raises 2 points, really. The first, that the cohesion between law enforcement and the National Crime Agency, in my view, has never been better. We understand what the shared objective is. We have a good understanding of how we need to get there. We don't always agree, and that's healthy. I find it difficult to agree with myself sometimes, so agreeing with others can be difficult. But we know where we want to get to, and we know how we want to get there. But there's one great flaw in the plan, and that is that from neighbourhood, community, through to international, as Lynn has very well explained, there's a lack of resource. And the resource required to actually combat what is, I think, the single biggest threat to this country needs to be addressed very, very quickly. If you're not sure about that level of threat, and not just at the high level, not just at the NCA level, but in communities, feel free to visit some parts of Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, Liverpool, where you can see the absolute scale of devastation that serious and organised crime causes. I must say at this point as well, we get excellent support from the Home Office and the relevant ministers. But it's only by having that level of coordination, cohesion, as Lynn says, that's the only way we're going to tackle this corrosive problem. So yes, crucial problem nationally, crucial problem internationally, and that problem needs investment from neighbourhood right through to the international. That is when we will start to make a real difference. As I've said, we need to make that difference quickly.
Thank you, Andy. And now, Bob Wigley. So money laundering is a subject that is close to my heart, and there's no getting around the fact that over the past 25 years or so, the United Kingdom has become a major centre of international money laundering. So how do we go about reducing this?
Okay, if I may, I'll come back to money laundering as part of a wider group of remarks, but I will address your question very specifically. Let me first say that we're, as an industry, four square behind Lynn and the work that the NCA is doing on this issue. We know that criminals who undertake this activity exploit some of the most vulnerable people in our society. They bring drugs, they bring violence to our streets and threaten the very fabric of our economy. And that is why, for the finance industry, stemming the flow of illicit finance that underpins this activity is an absolute priority. It's also the top priority for the organisation I chair, UK Finance. Post-Brexit, we think the mantra for the UK should be the safest and most transparent place to conduct financial business in the world. It isn't today. So, just a few quick initiatives, and then I'll come back to money laundering specifically. Recently, we've delivered something called the Banking Protocol. It's a rapid scam response scheme between branch staff and law enforcement. It's already detected and protected £56 million of fraud and led to over 450 arrests. We're working very closely with the Home Office on our Take 5 to Stop Fraud campaign. This is simply the notion that if someone asks you for your personal data, just stop for 5 seconds and think, should you be handing it over? And you'll have seen that hopefully on the tubes in the newspapers and on your ATMs. We're supporting the specific work of police around targeting dedicated work on major card gangs. So a lot of the activity that happens in the credit card space is undertaken by very serious gangs. We have something called the Dedicated Card and Payment Crime Unit, which is based in our office. The industry funds it, and last year it prevented 94 million of fraud and disrupted 11 organised crime groups. And that's in the context of overall spending by our industry of about 5 billion a year specifically on fraud and fraud compliance. So let me turn to money laundering. Today we have a system which underpins the anti-money laundering effort known as the Suspicious Activity Reports System. Bluntly, it is not as effective as it should be. It generates about 20 million alerts every year, which after costly human intervention, we think a broad cost to the industry of about 1.5 billion per annum, results in about 400,000 reports being submitted to the NCA. Too many of these, however, are low in value and low in terms of intelligence and information. And I think the most recent year for which I have figures, about 230 people were arrested. So it's very clear that the money we're spending today is not as effective as it could be. And that is why we, as the Industry Association, are hosting, I think literally have 20 people from the Home Office in our office at the moment. We're working in partnership to see how that system can be reformed so that we have more meaningful interventions and we hope target and lock up more serious criminals. Just turning, if I may, very quickly to cyber, which you touched on. We think as an industry this is our most clear and present danger. So again, we're working very closely with the Bank of England, the National Cyber Security Centre, to address this. We've set up something called the Financial Sector Cyber Collaboration Unit. It's all about bringing the standards of the 19 banks which represent the critical national infrastructure element of the banking system up to the standard of the very best. And once established and working fully, its mission will be to proactively identify, analyse, assess and coordinate activities to mitigate this hugely systemic risk and ultimately to strengthen the resilience of the UK financial services sector. Final comment, we do need some help from government around some new laws and powers, and we're in discussion with government about this. We know that criminals who are very smart deliberately target and exploit gaps in the legal and regulatory frameworks that permit information sharing between banks when we suspect there is bad behaviour. And that's something we need to address. We've made the point to the Law Commission as part of its review on anti-money laundering, and we look forward to their conclusions. Let me finally say the key to cracking this enormous problem, or at least the element of it that relates to economic crime, is, we believe, more effective public-private partnership. And that's why across these series of measures you'll see the theme is very much we as the industry working very closely with law enforcement and the intelligence agencies to bring our collective efforts to bear. I sit on the Economic Crime Strategy Board with the Chancellor, with the Home Secretary and probably many other people in this room. And there we have agreed two things: to create a joint threat assessment which brings the best of intelligence from the public sector and the private sector together so that we have one threat assessment, and then from that to develop a clear set of priorities for action which is systematic and prioritised so we can go after the biggest problems with the best coordinated public-private sector effort. So there I'll stop if I may.
Thank you very much, Bob. Okay, time for your questions from the audience. Usual rules. I will point to you, and if you could give us your name and your organisation, and you can ask anyone on the panel anything you want. Madam there, I think, in the red. I can't see very well, so if I get your gender wrong or whatever, please forgive me.
Is this work?
Yeah.
It's working. Lizzie Bearden from The Independent. There was a brief mention from Brexit, a favourable one, saying that you believe it could make the UK a safer place to do business. But could the Chief Constable and maybe the Director talk about the impact that you're expecting in October? I know there are still a lot of maybes, but are you viewing Brexit as a positive opportunity, or are there still concerns about the impact it might have on capacity?
As you'll be aware, the planning from policing linked in with the National Crime Agency and other agencies is well in place for any eventuality in relation to Brexit. As a police officer, obviously, I don't take sides in politics. We just look at what the contingencies required are for each and every eventuality. Certainly in relation to should we leave with a no deal, there will be an awful lot of negotiation required, which we are ready to do to ensure that we still have the same grip on criminality internationally as well as nationally. And as I say, ourselves, the National Crime Agency and other agencies are working very closely in relation to that. On a wider policing basis, it is really difficult to tell. But whatever happens, whichever way it goes, policing will be ready for those eventualities.
And from a National Crime Agency perspective, we have three responsibilities. Our first responsibility is to assess the nature of the threat. And if you read the National Strategic Assessment documents that we've produced today, they detail the areas where we think there could be an impact from Brexit. It's worth, of course, pointing out what should be very obvious, and that's that serious and organised criminals are highly adaptable. So in the same way we're watching what's happening, they're watching what's happening, and we know they might change their methodology depending whatever the outcome is. Our second responsibility is that we administer many of the law enforcement tools on behalf of the law enforcement system, so the European arrest warrant, access to the SIS information system, which is an intelligence system. There are many more. And one of my DGs, Steve Rodhouse, has been leading the law enforcement group to understand the consequences of access to or loss of those tools depending on the circumstances. And our last responsibility, one of the specialist capabilities the National Crime Agency provides on behalf of law enforcement, is a very extensive international network. So we have a number of officers based overseas, around 200 at any particular time. So actually building long-standing, productive relationships with European partners from a law enforcement operational perspective is something we are working very hard to continue to do.
We have a question.
Here, madam.
Thank you. Anna Sergi from the University of Essex. My question, I guess, is more for Mr. Cook here, but I guess everyone could answer. So on page 46, the report mentions the realistic possibility that the UK's exit from the EU will impact the prevalence of bribery and corruption over the next 5 years. I'm mostly looking at borders and how likely it is with Brexit that, let's say, seaports, such as Liverpool, will experience three different things, and I wanted to know what is the likelihood of these things happening according to the panel. So first, the more attempts to corrupt customs and border agents by both national and international groups, as well as more attempts to infiltrate port economy and services, including cyber capabilities of the port, any port, to enable both legal and illegal businesses for organized crime groups. Also due to the likelihood of cocaine, in this case I'm looking at cocaine, but could be other shipped drugs, cocaine prices increasing due to the increasing risk of detection at the borders. And if any of this happens, how do we tackle it? Thank you.
Andy.
Wow, okay. I only came here as a favour to Lynn. All right, I think I think the crucial part is that Brexit or no Brexit, I think all the things you mentioned will be a threat no matter which way the country decides to go. Certainly in relation to corruption of public officials, and I include in that police officers, NCA officers, border officials, local government, you name it, it is a growing threat, undoubtedly, and it will continue to be a growing threat, which is why law enforcement needs to adapt to ensure that we are on top of that threat, and we have means, usually but not predominantly technical means, which cost money, to stay on top of that. In relation to the porosity of the borders and guns, drugs and other things getting through, yes, that is the situation at the moment, and that will continue to be a growing problem for us unless we ensure that we are doing all we can to restrict that freer movement, whether that's through parcels, whether that's through ports around the country, whether that's into the big ports such as Liverpool, big container ports, and we know the row sort of approach and the large-scale importations we can get, and that the National Crime Agency and police have been very, very professionally dealing with some exceptionally large seizures. But it is a growing problem. It's a growing problem for this country. Certain organised crime is a growing problem for this country. And each of the three things you mentioned there, irrespective of Brexit, will increase in threat.
Lynn, do you want to add to that, or you?
So my short reply would be what he said. The reality is, if you read the National Strategic Assessment that we've circulated, we've had a number of outstanding results, some of which are included in that document, some work we did with the Metropolitan Police Force targeting a border force officer who was looking to import high numbers of drugs and guns. That remains a priority for us because we know organised criminals adapt and try and corrupt different bits of the system depending on the prevailing circumstances.
Before I go back to the audience, I've had a question sent up to me from moneylaundering.com, and that's the website of the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. And the question is, what role do banks play in terms of providing intelligence to the National Economic Crime Centre, which is, for those who don't know, it's a unit within the NCA, relatively young unit within the NCA. What sort of actions are they being asked to take in the coordination within an NECC operation? And I guess I'd ask Lynn and Bob if you have any remarks on that.
So within this financial year, we've launched within the National Crime Agency a new National Economic Crime Centre. We've done that because we identified two things. Firstly, we identified that intelligence across the whole of the law enforcement and private sector system was not being joined up as effectively as it needed to. And what that meant was that if you were a victim, particularly of fraud, there was a very strong likelihood that you would not get a response and your case would be passed from police force to police force, from organisation to organisation. So we made a case that was strongly supported by government. It is part, if people are wondering what's in the 2.7 billion, the money we got to build the National Economic Crime Centre is only 1 year money. So we are going into spending review with a pitch of part of the 2.7 billion is that we need to sustain that going forward. So the National Economic Crime Centre builds on an arrangement that we had built with 6 of the biggest banks, which we called our Joint Money Laundering Intelligence Team. In that situation, we fast time share intelligence one with the other, but the National Economic Crime Centre seeks to far more radically systemise that and work with a broader set of partners. And I'm really proud and pleased to see some of those partners there today. So the Financial Conduct Authority, HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, the Serious Fraud Office, the City of London Police, and of course the Crown Prosecution Service and us, coming together alongside the private sector to understand the nature of the threat. And fundamentally, when we've identified that there is a case that needs investigating, having a very honest conversation one with the other about which organisation to do that investigation, or whether it's an investigation where different skills of different organisations will be better brought together. So some of the work done in the private sector, some of the work done, for example, in the Serious Fraud Office, where they've got some brilliant forensic accountants, some of the work done with our civil recovery powers, but perhaps the investigation led by the City of London Police. So at the moment, the intelligence sharing is limited. As Bob says, we've been strongly supported by UK finance. There are still some concerns about whether law and regulation allows them to share the level of intelligence that we would like them to in the way they would like to too.
I think Lynn's covered the main points. Maybe if I just come at it from a slightly different angle, which is money mule accounts. Sadly, a lot of this money that flows around the system goes through these mule accounts, which are actually opened perfectly legitimately through fully compliant KYC procedures and then operated by normal people for normal purposes for a period of time before they are, in effect, hijacked by criminals. And you probably have seen our Don't Be Fooled campaign recently, which was targeted specifically at university students. We think that probably roughly half the money mule accounts in the UK are operated by our children who are at university, which is a pretty terrifying thought, I think. So we're working hard on that. We're also, and you can go onto Snapchat or Instagram today and find adverts for people who will pay you to use your bank account. So we've had something called the Money Mules Tactical Initiative, and that's basically about using AI to spot the kinds of flows that are typical of this kind of activity, and then to go and investigate those accounts and, where appropriate, close them down. So that's one specific that we're doing in addition to all the things that Lynn mentioned.
Great, thanks. And in case anyone doesn't know, KYC is Know Your Customer, which is a standard anti-money laundering strategy within banks. At the front here, there was a gentleman that wanted to ask a question. Have we got a mic? Can we get a mic to the front? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wanted to ask about your call for the money.
Can you state your name?
Sorry, from The Guardian. Your call for the extra money. Can I ask a question which the Treasury might ask, which is, tell me exactly what the taxpayer will get for that, as opposed to yet another demand from law enforcement that scary things will happen if you don't do exactly what we want. And then let me ask the question the same way, the way probably everybody else will ask it is, given you're talking about a flourishing serious organised crime to record levels, given we've been through 10 years of austerity, has that played a part in making it easier for serious organised criminals on many fronts?
So to be clear, I don't run an agency that does the give me the money or the baby gets it. We have deliberately, in this assessment, made sure that we have always given underestimates of the extent of the threat, and if we can't stand up a number, it hasn't appeared in the assessment. And there are many people in this room who have worked on that assessment, and huge credit to them, because it is a highly impressive evidence-based document that we should pay attention to. So what will it buy, Vikram? At the moment, we have some capabilities in the National Crime Agency, and indeed in other bits of the law enforcement system, funded through Police Transformation Fund, National Cyber Security Grant, which are not sustainable into police funding. So the system-wide investment led by Pete Goodman, who I think is in the room, and our cyber specialist in the National Crime Agency, is funded through a one-off grant. The work that we are doing in the agency looking at the dark web and child abuse offenders is funded off one-year grant. The work that we are investing to look at the way we assess intelligence and build data connected to the launch of a National Economic Crime Centre is funded on one-year grant. We have to make all these things sustainable so that we can protect children and seize assets. So benchmarking that's the first thing. The second thing is we then need to grow new capabilities. So we need capabilities that do some of the things I spoke about in my speech, interrogate the dark web, undertake surveillance, forensic accounting, track illicit finance, build capability that allows us to track cryptocurrency, and some of the things that we want to do high-end and undercover online. And once we've done all of that, which is primarily about covert intelligence collection, then the third thing we need is investment in investigators, locally, regionally, and nationally, so they can put together very thorough investigations that we either put before criminal or civil courts. So that's the investment. First of all, making sure that we've got a very clear benchmark of everything that is currently funded through one-year funding. Secondly, building new covert capabilities that allow us to gather intelligence. Thirdly, building strength and capability in investigation teams, many of which are not the traditional police officer, might be very different skills, cyber skills, illicit finance skills.
And the austerity question?
Sorry, I didn't deliberately ignore it, Vikram. So the impact on austerity has been this approach to one-year funding pots. And actually, that makes it very hard for Andy or I to run the National Crime Agency or the regional structures or what is happening in law enforcement. The challenge, of course, for government is at the same time we are saying we need 2.7 billion, counter-terrorism, policing and the network will be saying something else, and local policing will come up with another figure. At some point, there is going to have to be a balancing conversation. I am just saying to you, on the basis of this threat assessment, we cannot afford for serious and organised crime to be pushed out of that conversation because it doesn't make for easy headlines.
The hands at the back there, there's one with a pen in it. That's all I can see. A disembodied hand and a pen.
Thank you. Tim Baker from the Daily Star. Just quickly, following the story in the FT this morning, has the NCA ever used the Pegasus software from the NSO group in Israel? And furthermore, do you think it's appropriate to be using software from foreign private companies when there's so much clamour around conversations like Huawei?
So you're one step ahead of me. I've been doing media interviews since 7:10 this morning, so I haven't seen the Financial Times article, and so it's slightly hard to comment. Do we aim to use a whole host of different tools to understand a changing threat? Yes, we do. In respect of the specific, I'm really sorry, I can't give you an answer. I just
so
haven't
you
seen
don't
the
know if
article.
you've used the software from NSO Group, Pegasus, because it's been around for quite a while now?
Not off the top of my head, but we can get back to you with that answer.
Here, in the front again. Then I'll go back to the back, I promise.
Danny Shaw, BBC. Two quick questions, if I may. One to Lynn and Andy, first of all. You're asking for a lot more money, huge amount of extra money. Does that mean you've given up the argument for changing the structure of policing? Because you have said before that the current structure with 43 police forces in England and Wales and others is not really compatible to tackling serious organised crime. So have you given up that argument now? You're just asking for extra cash. And a cheeky one, Ben Wallace, the Security Minister, is sitting here in the front row, and I just wondered if I could ask him whether he is sympathetic to your bids for extra funding.
Danny, I'm nothing if not determined and resilient. So it's still my personal professional view that the 43 force structure of England and Wales is not fit for modern purpose. However, I recognise for a whole host of different reasons that is not currently a political priority. So what we are saying through this assessment is that we think the capabilities need to be structured differently. We think there needs to be a clear, serious and organised crime funding stream, and that needs to be based on a detailed capability assessment, the work that we have already done with the Home Office and policing to set the right capabilities at local, regional and national level. As you know, I do have national tasking powers, but frankly, they are of little value if actually the capacity and the capability doesn't exist to task in the first place. And the only way through that is to create a system with one funding stream where, bluntly, individual chief constables and individual police and crime commissioners can't choose to disinvest out of a system that needs to pull together.
Andy, do you want to...
Yeah, I'll just add briefly on to the back of that. I mean, look, I agree. 43 forces to approach crime in this country is less than ideal. My personal desire would be for far less than that. I think we get a far more cohesive approach, but we do, on serious and organised crime, adopt a good level of cohesion due to the regional organised crime units, which makes it easier to actually task throughout, to actually corral the right resources at the right times. But it's not ideal. But as Lynn says, that's not going to be changed in the near future. 43 police and crime commissioners will have a view in relation to that. So on that basis, I think we best just focus on what we can achieve and forget what would be the optimal approach, because it's not going to happen in my service as a police officer.
Minister, do you want to take up the challenge?
Yeah, okay, I was just about to go.
Yes.
First of all, I think on the bit about reform, no one's given up on reform. There's more reform to do. Organised crime organises better. We have to organise better to meet it. That's what this is all about. It's about the serious organised crime strategies, about the regional organised crime units, which are contributed for, funded by and coordinated by the regional, all the forces in a region, is going from strength to strength, and that complements and enables the National Crime Agency to do an even more successful job, and that is the direction of travel, and that is only going to continue to develop. Do I have sympathy? Absolutely. Every day, Lynn and I work together to get those one-offs at the moment, ever since I've been the Minister. The SR, or the spending review, goes in a period, 3-year, 4-year, or 1 year, depending what's decided. There is an SR coming up. Anyone who's missed that really shouldn't be in journalism or politics, so it's on its way. We will be putting our bids in. We hear the agencies and the police loud and clear. And I know the Chancellor and the government understands that when we have a debate about security, that's not just about defence, that's about national security, and that's about organised crime. And I think the thing that shouldn't be underestimated is that the private sector has heard our calls loud and clear. UK Finance and other people who really need to step up and do more to harden the environment. The other people I would like to hear from at some stage in the next few weeks is what are we going to do about the accountants, the lawyers, and the estate agents, who also have a very strong role in making sure we tackle the illicit finance. If we can do that, join it up, and get a sympathetic hearing from the Chancellor, I think we'll be in the right direction.
Actually, if you want an interesting statistic, Danny, on that point, financial services firms contribute about 83% of all SARs, and I think law firms under 1% from memory. So if you think about the estimated roughly 100 billion of dirty money that sloshes around the UK every year, and a lot of it is going into property, the lawyers who are prosecuting those transactions need to be reporting more suspicious activity.
Yeah, again, SARS suspicious activity reports, standard anti-money laundering practice. Pauline Neville-Jones at the front. Baroness Neville-Jones, if you could give her the mic.
Behind you.
Just behind you.
Pauline Neville-Jones, former Security Minister. Lynn, I heard your very good interview on the radio this morning, and what emerged from that, and again from your presentation, is this pretty horrifying statistics of the rise in all forms of crime, both serious and organised. The question I wanted to ask you, however, is how confident are you that part of that picture is not actually composed of better detection, better discovery, better understanding of a situation that may not be actually arising quite as fast as that, but what we're doing is actually uncovering the extent of it. How are you dealing with that? Seems to me to be quite a challenging analytical issue for you.
Such a pertinent question. There is no doubt with serious and organised crime that the more we look, the more we find. And we can evidence that across the range of threats. Whether modern slavery and human trafficking, whether we look at county lines, the increase from 720, how much of that is an increase and how much of it is just we coordinated and understood better. It is why we have asked the government for investment in the National Assessment Centre that we are establishing within the National Crime Agency. Knowing your background, it seeks to do what JTAC does for counter-terrorism, so that we can make that highly informed judgment about what is knowing more and what is happening more. But having said that, we do think there are some very strong indicators in the report about things that are growing, primarily through the use of technology. So the rise of the dark web for child sexual abuse offenders, for trading in people online, for trading in drugs and firearms is a definite new threat. The rise of cryptocurrency is definitely a new threat. And the impact of cyber and cyber connected to illicit finance is definitely new and growing.
Sir. Who's got the mic? Sorry, right behind you, Pauline, right behind you.
Just, this is a question for Lynn, and also actually for Glennie, perhaps, and Mr. Wallace, if he doesn't needs to retreat. But
Name and
We just
affiliation.
talked about, yes, we just talked about...
Name and affiliation.
Martin Bennett from Evening Standard, sorry. About dirty money, property and so on. Are you disappointed that there's only been one unexplained wealth order so far? The number of civil recovery cases that you have, we had a good one on the weekend, but there don't seem to be quite as many as there might be. And yet you go down to the commercial courts and there are multiple cases going through there of very, very high-profile people with sometimes court judgments indicating there's been fraud, corruption and so on. And yet very little action seems to be taken. Is there a flaw in the legislation? Is this a disappointment to you? There hasn't been more action so far, and Misha Glennie, since you actually projected this into public consciousness so well with your book and the series that followed it, what's your view?
So I'm not disappointed in the performance of my agency at all. I think there has been some outstanding work done, which meant that we did secure the first unexplained wealth order for the country. But you're right, Martin, it is new legislation, and it is notable that we are still going through appeal after appeal through that court process. And you'll understand that I do not want to expose my agency to disproportionate legal costs. That's not to say that we're going to be frightened of taking cases on, but I do want to have some stated case legislation that helps us understand the boundaries of that law. We have now established the National Economic Crime Centre under Graham. The 2.7 billion sees, in my view, a requirement for a significant uplift in those who deal with civil recovery and asset denial. You know, if you look at that case from last week, £6 million recovered, including a hotel and a Bentley. It took us 8 years. So there is definitely something about the skills and the capabilities in the organisation to respond, and that is part of the 2.7 billion investment. We are clear that is a priority for the agency because, in my view, illicit finance underpins almost all serious and organised crime. The only other motivation highlighted in the National Strategic Assessment is the child sexual abuse motivation, but other than that, they're motivated by money. So the more money we can take off criminals, it will stop them supplying drugs, it will stop them using violence, it will stop them supplying firearms, it will stop them transmitting people. Even child abusers, we are now seeing paying for services online. So the role of the National Economic Crime Centre and that investment is critical to our success.
I'll just say very briefly, I'm reluctant as chair to make any comment, but essentially the unexplained wealth order is a very, very resource-intensive operation because by definition the people you're going after have a lot of resources at their disposal and they're very good at tying people up in courts and complex legal cases. But I think the NECC is going to be absolutely critical in finding strategies to develop the unexplained wealth order legislation as a tool. I think the other thing I would say is that the sooner that we can have an end to the practice of anonymous companies investing in this country, the better. Legislation has been passed which will bring that into effect. I think at the moment the date is 2021. But there are still some loopholes there. So those are the two main issues, I would say, when it comes to large-scale money laundering. There's a gentleman there, I saw, yes. Can we have a microphone over there? And then I promise I'll go back to the back of the room.
Yes, Anthony Stansfield, I'm the PCC for Thames Valley, which is one of the largest police forces. But going back to the issue of 42 regional and local police forces, the majority do not have the capacity or the capability to take on a great deal of serious organised crime, especially fraud. And if we are to retain 42 forces, we're going to have very, very much larger hubs into which we put all our specialist capabilities and put into that a serious organised fraud central at a regional level. Because until we do that, fraud is simply not being looked at except by the very largest forces at the moment.
Thank you. Anyone at the back who I can't see? Right at the back there and then there. So 1 and 2. I'm going to take 2 questions, if I may. 1 and 2, both on the flank there.
Thank you. Bernard Ricks from Policing Insight. A question for Lynn. I believe you have statutory powers to instruct forces to act. Do you use those powers very often, and do you see any need for strengthening those powers?
And the second question, further up the...
And one for Lynn, Philip Ingram from Grey Hair Media. You've mentioned terrorism twice. You've mentioned finance. Given the fact that extreme right-wingism, or right-wing terrorism has been moved up to a national issue, and the fact that in 2014 Forbes Israel published a report putting the real IRA, an element of the new IRA, who allegedly killed Lara McKee, the Northern Ireland journalist, put them in between Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab as the 9th richest terrorist organisation in the globe. What's the link between serious and organised crime and terrorist financing?
I'll take them in the order they came, if that's okay with you. So you're absolutely right, Bernard. I do have tasking powers. I have tasking powers that enable me to task chief constables to take activity in certain circumstances. As I alluded to a few moments ago, though, they're as good as the capabilities that are locally to respond. And Anthony made the point that actually, if there is no fraud capability in a force or at a regional level, actually that lever of tasking becomes pretty meaningless. So what do I want to see? I want to see a SOC funding system from the national to the local. I want us to have agreement about what capabilities are needed locally, regionally and nationally. Once that funding and capability is in place, it will then be possible for me to use my tasking powers. But I think there is another lever that at the moment is not used to the effect it should be by the Home Office, and that is the strategic policing requirement. So whilst the strategic policing requirement is a have regard to requirement on chief constables and police and crime commissioners, it is very threat focused at the moment. So if you could say you have a response to drugs, regardless of how good that response is, you're actually meeting your requirement. We would like to see it evolve to focus on capabilities and define the capabilities that must exist. As Andy has said, we work very, very closely together. The tasking powers have been used 3 times, once by my predecessor on child abuse and 2 recently by me, 1 on county lines and 1 on firearms. But we worked very closely together in defining what those were, why they were needed, and whether there was the capacity and capability to respond. Because actually, having been a chief constable, it would not be professional of me to require a serious and organised crime tasking that I knew a police force actually physically couldn't deliver, because that would, at its heart, undermine or hurt communities, and that's why I'm not here for that.
And the second question was counter-terrorism.
So at the moment, the National Crime Agency doesn't lead on counter-terrorism. Counter-terrorism is led by the Metropolitan Police Service through a CT policing network led by Assistant Commissioner Neil Basu. He is a very professional and close personal colleague. We do have a board that we co-chair where we look for overlaps between CT and organised crime. You've rightly touched on one of the areas where there might be overlap, which is in financing, and we are talking to them about what service the National Economic Crime Centre could provide to them. The other service we already provide to them is cyber investigation. So if they were to have a terrorist incident that had a cyber link, either we would supply resources to their investigation or we would take that subset of their investigation. So it's close and interlinked, but at the moment I'm not the lead on that area. So in responding to your specific set of circumstances, it would be an inquiry into us for support from CT Policing, led by Neil Basu.
Sir, here.
Mike Sullivan, Sun. I think this one will be for Lynn or possibly Peter. Within your speech, Lynn, you mentioned that referrals on child sex abuse have gone up by 700%, referrals from industry. Could you just expand a little bit, please, on, if you have the figures to hand, what the 700% actually means, so total number of referrals there are now, and whether perhaps you feel that more could be done?
So perhaps I can just unpick that figure, because you are right to focus on it, Mike. At the moment, industry, when they come across, so tech companies, when they come across an indecent image of a child, their responsibility is to report it into an organisation based in the United States called NCMEC. NCMEC then make the referrals into what we call the CSE Bureau within the National Crime Agency. And it's that has gone up by 700%. So when they come across images, they report them into us. Now, since we published the report, actually, if we were to include this year's figures, it would be an even bigger increase. It would take you to over 850%. And that's one of the consequences of the consultation on the online harms bill. What we are... Oh, I see what you're asking. No, the numbers are significant. We can get you the actual numbers, but when you look at what it means in outcome terms, it's 400, it leads to 400 arrests every month. Sorry, 400 children safeguarded and 500 arrests every single month across the law enforcement family. But we can get you the actual numbers, Mike. But that's what I'm trying to get across is that's one strand of reported intelligence. At the same time as you've got that single strand of intelligence, you've also got the work that we are proactively doing within the National Crime Agency and alongside our partners in the UKIC family to look at what is happening in the dark spaces, so in the dark web online, and that is how we are able to put this figure, 2.88 million dark web sites, 2.88 million users on dark websites worldwide, with at least 5% of them based in the UK. So actually, at the same time that reports are being made to us proactively by industry, we are also seeing different online behaviour. And within there, in this financial year, we've seen a real change in behaviour. So to access dark websites, sometimes you are required to abuse a child. So we have stories, real-life convictions, of an offender wanting to access a site and being told you can only access this site if you rape a child. And they have raped 6-month-old, 2-year-old, 5-year-old children. And as a result of that, we have intervened. And our proposition to industry is you have got to do so much more about those sites that you've personally got access to, because that will then enable us to really focus on the very high harm offenders that are causing contact offending with children. But we can give you all the numbers, Mike, because we have them in some detail.
Peter Wunless of the NSPCC, do you want to comment on that?
Only perhaps to draw the parallel between some of what Lynn is requesting of industry here and some of the progress that's been made on financial crime that we were hearing about earlier, and the contrast between one bit of the economy which is kind of flourishing but is unregulated, and another which is highly regulated. And so the tools and the techniques and the opportunities and the punishments that exist for financial companies are way different from the environment in which the tech companies are operating. So at this moment in time, we're appealing to the great goodwill of the tech companies to take these responsibilities seriously and understand what is going on your sites and what you could and should be able to do ahead of what I very much hope will be a regime which will be in place at the earliest opportunity, although, of course, getting legislation through and all the rest of it is not the easiest thing at the moment, which will replicate some of the sanctions and demands and powers which a new independent regulator will have for the tech industry, as we have for financial services.
At the back there was yes, there's an arm again. It's disembodied, but it's got a pen in it, I think. No.
Glasses.
That's it, it's still up.
Hello there, Simon Boone. I'm from the trade union of the NCA. It's a question for you, Lynn. It's not about pay, don't worry. Historically, the National Crime Agency, SOCA, the crime squads before it, had a very hard focus on drugs as an operational priority. That seemed to soften over the last couple of years. Unfortunately, at the same time, when the police forces were hit by resourcing restrictions. Do you think that was a mistake by the National Crime Agency, which has unfortunately delivered the crisis in drugs in the UK? Or do you think this supports your bid for additional money to help you focus on all the threats rather than simply the ones you can afford?
I think the way that we used to look at the threats doesn't meet the modern age. So there was a time when serious organised crime was only about drugs, and it was only about firearms, and it was only about violence in communities. To be clear, that still exists. That is why we have co-joined those three things as a priority. You know, those who intimidate communities by trading in drugs and firearms and causing harm. But the threat evolved. The threat evolved into child abuse, the threat evolved into modern slavery and human trafficking, the threat evolved into organised immigration crime. That's why I have a focus on the vulnerable. And it's also involved online, cyber illicit finance. So, Simon, what I think we have to be is just a bit more sophisticated. That concept of this sort of hierarchical, old-fashioned organised crime group that is only about power and violence in communities is one strand, but there are another two to equal the three, and that is why we go into government and say, actually, this threat is chronic, it's corrosive, it's changing, and that's why it needs investment.
Thank you. Madam, there. Oh, the mic's coming your way now.
Hi, I'm Carmen Villa from the London School of Economics. And I wanted to go back to a sentence that Peter said earlier, which was, let's look at children as children. And so in the light of county lines, gang violence, and all these other topics that involve young offenders, which, in your opinion, are other institutions on top of law enforcement that are really helping us solve perhaps the societal failure of some people who have ended up, you know, becoming offenders? What can we do to break this victim-offender cycle?
Oh, it's a big question,
I think that was
isn't
to you, yes.
So, well, I think we could take it right back to the bonds which babies strike with their parents and their carers right from the start of life. There are a whole set of issues around the resilience and the coping mechanisms which children have growing up that make them more or less susceptible to risk factors later on. So there are questions of good parenting, good nurturing, and development. There are issues of education and learning and support to help young people see that a gift horse. Looking at a gift horse and mouth of gift horse probably is a gift horse. There's no such thing as a free lunch. I'm mixing all my kind of metaphors and cliches here, but there's something about understanding what's appropriate and what's inappropriate behaviour in a life where you may feel neglected and lost and lonely, and that may be being contributed to by a life led online increasingly in your bedroom with fewer kind of social connections you might have had in the past as a consequence of there being fewer engagement activities for young people to get engaged and involved with in their communities. For some young people it will be about children's services, mental health support. There are a lot of pressures on young people at the moment growing up, and it's increasingly obvious to predators who young vulnerable people are. And I think all these things are conspiring to make it a real challenge. So certainly health and social services, youth support, good parenting, good community engagement. These are all things which can make a contribution. But at the end, as I said, children are children, and when a young person is exploited, it is absolutely not their fault. So you talked about young offender. I would question whether significant numbers of these young people are actually offenders at all, or if they are victims of other people who are committing serious and organised crimes.
There's a follow-up question here, Lynn, from Stephen Rimmer of Bernardo's, who says that they too are seeing increasing numbers of vulnerable children being exploited by organised crime. But he also said that this is not just about the lack of resources, but still, and he stresses, insufficiently joined up working across all the key partner agencies. What further leadership can the NCA demonstrate to change those ways?
It's a complex question because actually partnerships need to interlink in all sorts of different places. So they need to interlink very locally in localities, in police forces, and very, very local communities. And then they need to link nationally. So we have found with county lines that actually we needed to be able to share the intelligence one with the other, because actually in geographic locations, one force might have the offender, the other force might have the exploited victims, and the other person might have the drug supply customer, which is why we see this as a whole system. It's a slightly opaque language. I know that doesn't help everyone, but actually establishing the County Lines Coordination Centre within the National Crime Agency is allowing us to join all those dots. It's then up to Andy and I to work really hard with our Chief Constable colleagues to make sure that as we understand the national dots and task the right operations to the right places, actually then for the prevent and protect activity, that happens very locally. But I'm very happy to work with Bernardo's if you think there is more we could or should be doing in that area.
Andy, you wanted to come in on that?
Just very briefly, if I may. Yeah, we still have more work to do in relation to it, but just as a slightly side point, and I probably shouldn't say this, but it's my honest belief, that not every 15 to 17-year-old involved in drug supply and violent crime is a victim. Some of them are hardened offenders, some of them come from generations of hardened offenders, and we need to treat every case on its merits. But it's no good looking at everyone as a victim as part of this, because quite simply, they're not.
And we've got a question here from Charles, I think it's Himes at the Daily Telegraph. He says that the NCA report highlights increasing violence in all crime types, e.g. car crime. Why is this? Lynn?
So that's absolutely one of the conclusions of this report, so that we're seeing an increase in organised acquisitive crime for the first time for a number of years. And not all of that has violence connected to it, but there are specific patterns, particularly in some areas of the country. So hijacking of vehicles and stealing of ATMs, so the cash points that get dragged off the front of supermarkets. Why do I think that is? I think because the fundamental thing for them is it's all about making money. So there is a real responsibility on the whole system, from the National Crime Agency, policing and down, to make sure that crime doesn't pay, to intervene early, to make assertive arrests, and once we have made arrests, then to make sure that we seize people's assets. And that absolutely requires a focus, because Andy and I join policing and law enforcement to protect the public, and it is concerning to see the rise of violence that we are currently seeing in not all, but definitely some communities of the UK.
Time for a couple more questions. Any to come? There on the aisle towards the back.
Mike Levy, Cardiff University. Lynn, you previously argued that the public doesn't have a properly serious appreciation of organised crime. I'm just wondering what the panel, including yourself, might think we can do to address that, other than to have sessions like that.
So as I said towards the end of my speech, the public are our eyes and ears, but they can also be the motivator of some serious and organised crime. So some of that's genuinely illegal. So I think there is more that we need to do as a whole community to understand what cocaine use actually means. What does it mean to the rainforests of Colombia? What does it mean to those who are exploited in the drug supply? That's illegal activity. Similarly, modern slavery and human trafficking. If you go to a nail bar, or if you have your car washed by somebody, and as was said earlier, if it looks to be too good to be true, it probably is too good to be true. So I think there is more that we can and should do on our prevent messaging. And then within this report, one of the things we've done this year, which we haven't done previously, is list a whole load of actions that people can individually take. So whether it be cybercrime online, how you protect yourself and your assets, whether it be on child abuse, how you teach your children to keep safe online through the use of the CEOP online resources and tools, how you pass intelligence to policing. It's here in this report. We do need all of you to help us get the message out there, because I'm afraid serious and organised crime just doesn't, people just don't get what we're talking about. And when you get into the detail and you talk about child abuse, or you talk about drug supply, or you talk about firearm supply, or you talk about modern slavery, people sort of get it. But when you say you need to prevent serious and organised crime, they can't quite see their role. So I think there is something about how do we all come together to create the narrative, which is really meaningful if you live in one of the communities and don't currently think you're a victim.
Andy?
I think the understanding and perception of people in relation to serious and organised crime is definitely affected by where they live. Because if you live in some of the estates, some of the areas within all of our cities, it's a daily scourge that's impacting upon lots and lots of people. The number of young people being shot and stabbed in relation to it is frankly scandalous, and I'm not sure we'd put up with that anywhere else. The number of people who are being intimidated by organised criminality across large swathes of our cities is quite unacceptable. But for some people, it's something they read about in a newspaper. It's not something they live every day. Getting that message across is really difficult. Another commissioner, the Met's, tried recently, as a few of us have, in relation to the impact of social cocaine taking, which is a laugh, it's a good fun, etc., etc. No, it's not. I've got young people on the streets of Merseyside being shot in relation to it. No fun in that at all. But that message doesn't seem to get any further than the cities itself. So in answer to your question, understanding of serious and organised crime, a perception of it, is very much down to where you live.
There's a gentleman here with a beard who's been very patiently waiting. He's going to have the last question.
Thank you. Michael Knowles from the Daily Express. Last year at the NPCP conference, there was a graphic which highlighted the funding shortfalls of the regional organised crime units. How much has that contributed to the rise in organised crime?
I think both myself and Lynn and the Home Office have worked together to ensure that that funding is maintained, so that the gaps that we were anticipating in relation to the regional organised crime units, the funding gaps, which would have meant us scaling back an awful lot of our work, hasn't hit. It's not to say it won't hit next year, but in the short term, as a result of good work, I've got to say, within the Home Office, from Lynn, myself and other partners, in ensuring that this didn't go away, that short-term problem has been averted to a great extent. But we're talking, at best, standstill, not move forward money. So we are just about making ends meet. As has been mentioned many times today, we need to take the next big step forward.
Bob, have you got any final comments inspired by what you've heard today? Well, you don't have to if you don't want to.
I think well, maybe a couple of comments. One which is nothing to do with UK finance, but just as a personal observation, having had 3 teenage children. I said, I think there are a lot of naive parents around, and there will be people in this room whose kids are operating mule accounts that they will not be aware of, and the kids may not even realise they're doing something illegal. But unfortunately, they will then be banned from having bank accounts in the future, and this will cause real problems in their lives. So I think parents need to help, as part of a mix of agencies and government and law enforcement, help their children. So that's one observation. And then I think, just to reiterate the point I made at the beginning, this is obviously a massive problem, or a massive series of problems, and the way to crack it is to have a very clear threat assessment, prioritise where the big issues are, and then for public and private sector, and within public sector, I thank you for your point about the financial services industry doing its part. We need to see the tech industry, we need to see retail and other areas play their part too, so that we can all work together to crack what is, frankly, a national embarrassment. So that's all I'd say.
Thank you, Bob. Lynn, the last word is yours.
So I need to end on a thank you. I'm absolutely delighted that so many of you are as interested as you are on this very important topic. It is clear that serious and organised crime is a chronic and corrosive threat. There is much detail in the document before you. What we haven't had a chance to get into today is some of the outstanding work of the officers across law enforcement and partners that is contained in that document. Be reassured, those officers will continue to work to the very best of their ability to protect the public, because that is their motivation every single time they come to work. And it's my responsibility to give a credible, honest assessment of the size and scale of the threat and to have that conversation about how that should be funded. But lots of us are working hard to make a difference. Thank you.
Lynn, thank you very much, and thank you to all our panelists. I'll just finish by saying to, if there are any reporters here, to take up Andy Cook's offer and go and see in situ what happens when areas become plagued by serious and organised crime. There are some extraordinary stories out there. And as somebody who works in the creative industries and journalism, in response to Mike's question, one of the reasons why we don't have enough social awareness of cybercrime is that we haven't had a very good series equivalent to things like The Line of Duty, McMafia and so on about cybercrime, with the honourable exceptions of Mr. Robot and Black Mirror. So those of you who work in television, it's let's get a really, really interesting series out on hacking. Thank you very much to all my panelists. Thank you for coming. And do read the NSA. It's well worth it.